in Princeton. On behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome you to tonight's class taught by Professor Jonathan D. Sarna. Before I introduce Professor Sarna, I would like to go over the ground rules for tonight's program. Professor Sarna will be devoting time at the end of the program to answer questions. Since our time will be limited, I will group your questions together and pose them to Professor Sarna. If you have a question anytime during the lecture, please use the chat function to ask it. Jonathan D. Sarna is universally considered one of the leading scholars of American Jewish life. He is university professor and the Joseph H. and Bell R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University, where he directs its Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. He is also the past president of the Association for Jewish Studies and the chief historian of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. Author or editor of more than 30 books on American Jewish history and life, his American Judaism, A History, recently published in a second edition, won 6 awards, including the 2004 Everett Book Award of the Year from the Jewish Book Council. Professor Sarna is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the American Academy of Jewish Research. His most recent books are When General Grant Expelled the Jews and Lincoln and the Jews, A History, and an edition of Casella Wayne by Cora Wilburn, the first and hereto unknown American novel. Jonathan, it's all yours.
Well, thank you very much. And it's really a great pleasure to be here. I dare say that the topic is more timely, really, than we could ever have imagined when you first invited me. If you can begin to show the slides, please. Okay, next slide. Um, just over a week ago, many of us were shocked while watching the insurrection unfold at the Capitol to see among the insurrectionists a long-haired, long-bearded man wearing a black Camp Auschwitz t-shirt emblazoned with a skull and crossbones, under it the phrase, "Work brings freedom," which is an English translation of the Auschwitz concentration camp motto, Arbeit macht frei. According to spectators, on the back of that t-shirt was the word staff, as if to glorify those who participated in the extermination of 6 million Jews. Now, we really shouldn't have been shocked at that. If you recall, the 2016 election was riddled with anti-Semitic memes and messages. Note that Star of David, the money in the background. A horrified Washington Post correspondent concluded that anti-Semitism is no longer an undertone of Trump's campaign, it's the melody. And then after that, a Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. Note the Hitler salute. A witness chants of, quote, "The Jews will not replace us." And a year after that, on October the 27th, 2018, a mass shooting at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue, allegedly perpetrated by a white nationalist who railed on social networks against immigrants, and the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. He left 11 people dead, 7 wounded. This is the deadliest attack ever on a U.S. Jewish community. Another attack 6 months later at the Chabad of Poway synagogue by a gunman who accused Jews of planning genocide of the European race, reinforced fears that alt-right extremists had Jews in their sights. Now, let's be clear, the alt-right is not alone in fomenting contemporary anti-Semitism. An attack in 2019 that killed 5 people at a kosher market in Jersey City, and another that same year at a Hanukkah party of a Hasidic rabbi in Muncie that killed 1 and wounded 5, demonstrated that militant African Americans on the extreme left have likewise committed anti Semitic violence. More commonly, left wing anti Semitism, though, has been concealed under the guise of anti Zionism. It demonizes those who support Israel and insists that Jews are not a nation, and that, next slide please, the Jewish state is a racist state that does not have a right to exist. Nearly 3/4 of all Jewish students surveyed in one study in 2015 reported being victimized by anti-Semitic canards, most from left-wing faculty and students, including the claims that Jews have too much power and that Israelis behave like Nazis toward the Palestinians. Now, the reason that we are shocked by all of this, and you invite me to speak, is that scholarly studies since really the mid 1990s had optimistically concluded that anti Semitism had pretty well ended in the United States. Some of those studies concluded that Jews, here, let's look at that. The Death of American Anti Semitism is a book that Jews, far from being persecuted, had instead become white folks in America, people of privilege. Many a young American Jew who grew up hearing about anti Semitism but not actually experiencing it likewise concluded that anti Semitism was history. It was akin to the old wars of religion that once pitted Catholics against Protestants. It's all past and over with, some thought. And that's why recent events have shocked so many American Jews, young ones in particular. Nothing had prepared them to expect that Jews in America would once again be targeted as Jews. So, what's going on? It's crucial, I think, first of all, to avoid 2 extremes. At one extreme, go back one. At one extreme stand those who darkly warn that catastrophe looms, that we are reliving what Jews in Germany experienced in the 1930s. And you can see that on that picture that illustrates that idea. And it seems to me false. In Germany, Jews suffered from state-sponsored anti-Semitism and from a whole series of infamous decrees that destroyed Jews' livelihoods, robbed them of their possessions, forced them to choose between exile and death. Nothing like that is taking place currently in the United States. But at the same time, we also have to beware of those who maintain at the other extreme that there's nothing at all to worry about, that anti Semitism scarcely exists. It's, yes, sort of created by Jewish organizations to justify their own existence, and that far from being the objects of hatred, Jews actually enjoy privilege and good fortune. That too is false, I think. There is no doubt that anti Semitism, akin to other forms of hatred, has risen alarmingly in recent years. We dare not minimize it, just as I think we should not exaggerate it. Now, the scholarly study of American anti Semitism began really with this article, a path breaking 1957 essay by the non Jewish historian John Hyam that serves as a starting point, even now, for serious scholarship on the subject. Hyam showed that anti Semitism played a discontinuous rather than a constant role in American history. He demonstrated that it waxed and waned over time, the peaks and the valleys closely linked to social and economic crises. He went on to underscore the very important theme of ambivalence that helped to explain anti Semitism's cyclical character. Diverse and conflicting attitudes toward Jews coexisted in the minds of Americans, he concluded. Many were pro and anti Jewish at the same time. I think you went in the wrong direction. He also related anti Semitism. Next slide, please. He also related, and no, no, one back, to social problems such as mass migration, economic dislocation, and the displacement of elites. Through anti Semitism, he argued, society gave a general problem an ethnic focus. Now, John Hyam's central themes, which were discontinuity, cultural ambivalence, the link between anti Semitism and larger social ills, and also conspiratorial fantasies. All of those themes dominate the study of American anti Semitism to this day. While Professor Hyam's essay focused on the late 19th century, when indeed the term anti Semitism entered the American lexicon, and overt forms of anti Jewish discrimination became commonplace, historians soon demonstrated that many of these same themes applied to earlier and later periods in American history as well. Now, today we know that antagonism toward Jews began in America with Jewish communal settlement in New Amsterdam, which is today's New York, going back to 1654. Next slide. The Dutch governor of that colony, Peter Stuyvesant, who considered all forms of religious nonconformity a threat to public order, singled Jews out as deceitful, very repugnant, hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. He sought to expel the bedraggled Jewish refugees who had arrived on his doorstep, giving them liberty, he exclaimed to the Dutch West India Company back in Amsterdam. We cannot refuse the Lutherans and the Papists. Yeah, there goes the neighborhood. You have Lutherans and Catholics and Jews, my goodness. These words serve as a reminder that in America, the fate of Jews and the fate of other persecuted minority groups were, from the very beginning, intertwined. Now, in the end, the Dutch West India Company required Stuyvesant to admit the Jewish refugees. Their economic benefit in a mercantilist economy trumped religious prejudice. Still, Jews continued to face episodes of rejection, prejudice, even occasional violence in the colonial era, while anti-Jewish literary stereotypes abounded. Jew was still a dirty word. The great historian of colonial Jewry, Jacob Rader Marcus, reminded his readers, and he showed that it was hardly rare to see the Jews denigrated as such in the press. At the same time, he also showed, recalling the theme of ambivalence, that Jews prospered in colonial America and maintained close, sometimes even intimate ties with non-Jewish neighbors. Now, the American Revolution affected changes in law and in the relationship of religion to the state that widened the parameters of religious liberty in the United States. Um, New York, with its long tradition of de facto religious pluralism, there were lots of different faiths in New York, became in 1777 the first state to extend the boundaries of free exercise and enjoyment of religious profession and worship to, quote, all mankind, whether Christian or not. The Northwest Ordinance, adopted in 1787 by the Continental Congress, extended guarantees of freedom of worship and belief into the territories north of the Ohio River. Finally, the federal Constitution and the Bill of Rights outlawed religious tests as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States, and it forbade Congress from making any law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, it's actually quite significant, I think, that none of the major American documents bearing on religious liberty mention Jews by name. The word Jew is not found in the Constitution. Jews gained their religious rights as individuals along with everybody else, not, as was frequently the case in Europe and the Caribbean, through some special privilege, often called a Jew bill, that set them apart as a group. Now, admittedly, it did require a hard-fought bill to win Jews to the right to hold public office in Maryland in 1826, and it took another 51 years before Jews achieved full legal equality in New Hampshire in 1877. Nevertheless, on the national level, and actually in most of the communities where Jews actually lived, they achieved legal equality by the end of the 18th century. Now, legal equality did not automatically translate into social equality. It didn't put an end to anti-Semitic stereotyping. Indeed, whenever tensions arose, such as during the closely fought 1800 election, there we go, pitting Thomas Jefferson against John Adams, whenever that happened, the baiting of Jews formed part of the arsenal of political mudslingers, even when, as in the case of a man named John Israel of Pittsburgh in 1800, the candidate in question wasn't Jewish at all. And 1800 is really the first presidential election where we see anti-Semitism, before that word existed, emerge in a presidential election. Now, the range of other anti-Semitic incidents in the early decades of the young republic spanned the spectrum from literary and cultural stereotyping, social and economic discrimination, attacks on Jewish property, all the way to blood libel allegations in the New York Herald and lurid descriptions of purported anti-Christian sentiments in classical Jewish texts like the Talmud. In 1820, a newspaper in New York reported, and you can see it here, that the city's Jews were not generally regarded with a favorable eye. Jew is an epithet which is frequently uttered in a tone bordering on contempt. And the article concluded that for all of America's vaunted toleration, prejudices against the Jews exist here and subject them to inconveniences from which other citizens of the United States are exempt. Now, ambivalence, so central to John Hyam's analysis from the late 19th century, turns out to be the key word in understanding earlier American responses to Jews as well. Indeed, conflicting emotions and changing experiences and divergent influences pulled people now one way and now the other way. At times, the lure of the exotic opened doors to Jews. Rural Americans, for example, sometimes traveled miles just to catch a glimpse of one of God's chosen people. But as would also be seen in the case of Asians, the lure of the exotic quickly gave way to fear of the unknown. Outsiders came to view Jews as an alien force, a people apart, as patronizing curiosity yielded to xenophobic delusion, doors slammed shut, and Jews found themselves excluded. Now, a second, even more powerful source of ambivalence, beginning before the Civil War, was a pervasive tension between received wisdom about Jews and perceived wisdom. In other words, between the mythical Jew, that cursed figure of Christian tradition deeply embedded in Western culture, and what I like to call the Jew next door, who seemingly gave the lie to every element of that demonic stereotype. Usually it was the mythical Jew, the unscrupulous moneylender, the eternal wanderer, the satanic Christ killer who was flayed by anti Semites, and if they sometimes realized the Jews of their personal acquaintance didn't fit the mold, well, that mold was too deeply ingrained to change. It was easier to live with the contradiction. Them Jews, oh, I didn't mean you. That was a phrase that an upstate New Yorker recalled hearing from neighbors. Similarly, Thomas Jefferson, in spite of the liberal sentiments he expressed when he corresponded with individual Jews, continued to maintain in other letters that Jews as a people were morally depraved. So simultaneously, individual Jews thrived in the 19th century, often rising to positions of wealth and power, and even intermarriage rates, which are a reliable, if sometimes unwelcome, sign of religious harmony, they spiked to high levels, indicating that on the ground, lots of Jews and Christians got on very well, even intimately. Nevertheless, popular prejudice based on received rather than perceived wisdom continued nonetheless. Now, it's very important for Jews to remember and for everyone to remember that African Americans, Catholics, Mormons, they actually experienced the brunt of American religious violence during the nation's first century. There is nothing in American Jewish history from that time that parallels um, the experience that these other groups experienced, and the horrors that these other groups experienced. In America, unlike in Europe, Jews were never the nation's only outgroup, and whatever prejudice Jews did experience, it's important, others suffered far worse. Churches that were burned, Mormons were chased out of the country, and African Americans, of course, suffered worst of all. Still, at the same time, the Civil War era, which of course was a period of heightened racial and religious tension throughout the United States, did also result in an unprecedented surge of anti-Semitism. The prominence of several Jews in the ranks of the Confederacy, notably President Jefferson Davis's right-hand man and cabinet secretary, Judah P. Benjamin. My favorite line about Judah P. Benjamin was the senator from Ohio, Benjamin Wade. He called Benjamin an Israelite with Egyptian principles. Um, but Judah Benjamin prominence, heightened prejudice against Jews, and some blamed Jews for a whole series of other evils associated with war, smuggling, speculating, price gouging, swindling, producing shoddy merchandise for the military. Indeed, Jews came to personify the foulest of wartime capitalism's ills. And this helps to explain why General Ulysses S. Grant, on December the 17th, 1862, issued General Orders Number 11, the most sweeping anti Jewish regulation in all of American history. It expelled, quote, Jews as a class from his war zone, which was a huge war zone stretching from northern Mississippi to Cairo, Illinois, from the Mississippi River to the Tennessee River, and he expels them for violating, quote, every regulation of trade. Now, President Abraham Lincoln reversed Grant's order of expulsion as soon as he heard of it, and he proclaimed, this is a line too frequently forgotten. I like it a lot. It should have been in the film. He proclaimed that he did not like to hear a class or nationality condemned on account of a few sinners. Now, after the Civil War, anti-Semitism crested in the United States. We usually date that between about 1877 and World War II. It is, of course, an era of massive social, industrial, economic, urban, and demographic change, dislocated millions of people, threatened traditional patterns of life, transformed the whole ethnic and religious character of the United States. So there are a lot of social tensions. And outsiders and newcomers, especially Blacks, Jews, Catholics, they bore the brunt of the social tensions stirred by these cataclysmic changes. So, for example, Jim Crow legislation at this time enshrined segregation between blacks and whites. Social Darwinist, racialist ideas spread across the country. Nativism and then isolationism captures hearts and minds. And as America's Jewish population surged from less than a quarter of a million nationwide in 1880 to well over 4 million some persuaded themselves that behind all of the changes roiling American life lay a clandestine Jewish conspiracy. Now, as I mentioned, next slide, please. The term anti-Semitism, born in Germany, entered American parlance early in this period, where Jews had previously been reviled on account of their religion, which some people, after all, thought, okay, a conversion can fix that. Now, like African Americans, Jews suffered on account of their race, their blood deemed forever inferior to that of the lofty Anglos, Saxons, Teutons. The late 1870s, consequently, witnessed new forms of discrimination against Jews, similar in kind, although certainly not to the same degree, as the civil rights violations that characterized the early Jim Crow laws. So, and you can see that in 1877, the famed Grand Union Hotel in Saratoga, New York, excluded banker Joseph Seligman, a friend of President Grant, one of the country's most respected Jewish figures. But he's excluded from the hotel. No Israelite shall be permitted in future to stop at this hotel. Judge Henry Hilton, who had become the owner of the Grand Union, announced, and within a few years, Jews as a class, which, remind you, is the same phrase Grant used in 1862, they were declared unwelcome, even at New York's Coney Island, and social discrimination against Jews became commonplace across the country. And indeed, this book uh, really, it's a pamphlet, but discloses much of the early history of social discrimination as becomes known. Anti-Semitism escalated further in the 20th century, especially in the years following World War I. Jews faced physical attacks, many forms of discrimination, as well as intense vilification in print, on the airwaves, in movies, on stage. Immigration restrictions, without explicitly saying so, look to limit the number of Jews entering the country. Educational quotas, restrictive covenants, occupational discrimination, and physical attacks against Jews limited the civil rights of those who had settled in the US already. A particularly infamous incident took place in Atlanta, where in 1913, a 29-year-old Jewish factory superintendent and local B'nai B'rith leader named Leo Frank was convicted of molesting and murdering one of his employees, 13-year-old Mary Fagan, and dumping her body in the basement of the pencil factory where they both worked. The case attracted a frenzy of publicity, and much of that centered on Frank's religion, the mark of his being an outsider in the South, a symbol of otherness and change. Crowds around the courthouse chanted, "Hang the Jew." They didn't say hang Leo Frank. They said hang the Jew. And when Georgia Governor John Slayton, unpersuaded that Frank was really the murderer, commuted his sentence in 1915 from death to life in prison, a mob that included many leading local citizens broke into the jail, kidnapped Leo Frank, and alas, as you can see here, they lynched him. It's the first known lynching of a Jew in American history. Many years later, an eyewitness confirmed what defenders of Leo Frank had long believed, that Mary Fagan was murdered by the janitor of the pencil factory. Leo Frank himself was innocent. It's quite ironic that today there's a Jewish senator from Georgia, from Atlanta. It shows you how much has changed from 1915 to 2021. 2021. Following World War I, as American grew disillusioned with internationalism, and they became fearful of Bolshevik subversion, and they became frightened that foreigners would corrupt the nation's values and traditions, we see that manifestations of anti-Semitism rose further. Immigration restrictions culminating in the national origins immigration known as the Johnson-Reed Act, here you can see it, of 1924, aimed directly at limiting the number of Jews entering the country. And Congressman Johnson, who authored the legislation, argued, based on a report from the director of the consular service, that America was in danger of being swamped by, quote, abnormally twisted and unassimilable Jews, filthy, un-American, often dangerous in their habits. Now, resulting legislation, this act didn't explicitly mention Jews, and didn't mention it by name any of the other groups, but the impact on persecuted Jews of these quotas proved particularly severe. At the same time, we learned from the president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis that within 3 years following the close of the war, meaning World War I, there was perhaps more anti-Semitic literature published and distributed in the United States than in any previous period of its history. And what made that literature particularly insidious and incendiary was that so much of it bore the imprimatur of a national hero, automaker Henry Ford. For 91 straight issues, beginning on May the 22nd, 1920, Ford's weekly newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, you see it here, purported to describe an international Jewish conspiracy based upon the notorious anti-Semitic forgery known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, first published in Russia in 1905. 4 volumes entitled The International Jew, which were really drawn from this series, reprinted these scurrilous charges, disseminating them in hundreds of thousands of copies, and they were filled with fantastic claims. Rule of the Jewish Kehillah grips New York. Jewish jazz becomes our national music, and so on. The truth is that these claims actually tell you much more about Henry Ford and his disdain for changes in American society than they tell you about Jews. And that's frequently true of anti-Semitism. It tells you more about the anti-Semite than it does about the victim. In any case, it's only in 1927, under intense economic and legal pressure, that Ford finally apologizes. By then, the damage had been done. Jews celebrated the apology, but it didn't have the impact that they thought it would. Now, while Ford attacked Jews in public, numerous American universities and colleges including Harvard and Yale and Princeton, privately worked to limit the number of Jewish students that they admitted. At Princeton, quota was about 3%. And lots of private academies and preparatory schools likewise limited the number of Jews. The extent of the restrictive quotas and the means used to achieve them, next slide please, differed from place to place. But what really mattered, and you see there at the bottom, we have no Hebrew patronage, but what really mattered for Jews was that they were excluded, not on the basis of merit, but simply on account of their ancestry and faith. It had nothing to do with merit. And even harsher restrictions faced Jews in fraternities, in clubs, in hotels, resorts, elite neighborhoods. There, in many cases, they were shut out completely, as this ad shows. Clubs in 15 different cities, large and small, are known to have barred Jews, while discrimination in luxury resorts was near universal. And in addition, bigoted practices and so-called restrictive covenants excluded Jews from some of the most desirable neighborhoods in major cities, as well as in the newly emerging suburbs. Um, so, for example, there are inviting apartments at Coney Island, um, on Coney Island, that shamelessly advertise themselves as being, and I quote, sensibly priced, sensibly built, and sensibly restricted. Physical violence against Jews also became common during this period. In the 1920s, the revived Ku Klux Klan badly frightened Jews, though it actually directed most of its animus against blacks and Catholics, and attacks increased in the 1930s, particularly in cities where German Americans sympathetic to Adolf Hitler took to the streets and where Catholic supporters of the increasingly pro-Nazi radio priest, Father Charles Coughlin, beat Jews mercilessly. In the 1930s, the new technology was radio. In our day, it's Twitter. In both cases, you see how it's exploited by hate mongers, and there are important debates. Should we restrict? How do we restrict? And so on. Um, uh, uh, Coughlin had an audience of 30 million, and he would whip them into a frenzy with his depictions of alleged Jewish misdeeds around the world. And for example, he explained Nazi attacks against German Jews on Kristallnacht, November 9th, 10th, 1938. Kristallnacht has been in the news recently, somewhat misused, I think, but he explained those attacks as simply a defense mechanism against communism, which he insisted meant the Jews were really responsible. To him, Jews and communism were synonymous. A largely Irish quasi-military organization called the Christian Front, which Coughlin inspired, went on to denounce, quote, President Roosevelt for what it called the Jew deal. And the Christian Front also conducted Nazi propaganda meetings, and they physically attacked Jews in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia. Meanwhile, the German American Bund, established in 1936, and as we know today, secretly funded by the Nazis, distributed anti Jewish propaganda, including blood libels. They organized youth camps on the model of the Hitler Youth in Germany. They conducted mass demonstrations, including one that filled Madison Square Garden in 1939. You can actually now see a YouTube of that whole pro-Nazi demonstration. By then, more than 4 in 10 Americans, 40%, told pollsters that Jews held too much power in the United States, and some, as an antidote, proposed that Jews should be driven from the country. It is important, nevertheless, to remember that for all that it had become widespread, anti-Semitism never went unopposed. Liberal newspapers and organizations like the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith openly fought it. A growing interfaith movement headed by liberal-minded clergy worked to counter it, and Jews themselves often found ways to circumvent it, sometimes by patronizing en masse those institutions that accepted them, and by creating parallel institutions like Jewish country clubs and Jewish fraternities, um, so that they could enjoy benefits even though the non-Jewish counterparts excluded them. So really, in contrast to what happened to Jews in most of Europe, where the Jews in the 1930s increasingly feared for their lives, American Jews, notwithstanding the anti-Semitism that they did face, they considered themselves fortunate. They didn't have to escape. Now, following World War II, and especially as consciousness of the destruction of European Jewry rose, and Americans sought to distinguish themselves ideologically from the Nazis, whom they had defeated, organized anti-Semitism in America declined dramatically. Between 1946 and 1950, the percentage of Americans who claimed to have heard any criticism or talk against Jews in the last 6 months dropped precipitously. It had been 64% in 1946. 4 years later, it was only 24%. Thanks to federal and state legislation, pressure from returning veterans, um, uh, government action, and media exposure. And here you see the film, the most famous of all the films to fight anti-Semitism, the Academy Award-winning Gentleman's Agreement. Uh, but in addition to that, there was a certain stigma of being compared to the Nazis, discrimination against Jews in employment and housing and daily life declines. Legislation plays some significant role there. It's worth knowing it helped Jews in many ways more than African Americans. By the early 1960s, almost all resorts and housing developments had dropped their restrictive clauses. Anti-Semitic college quotas, for the most part, ended, and professional fields, law, medicine, banking, proved more receptive to Jews than at any previous time in the 20th century. Now, that's not to say that anti-Semitism disappeared. It was especially prevalent in the South in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s, where opponents of civil rights punished Jews for their support of the movement. Synagogues were bombed throughout the South, culminating in the most horrific incident prior to the Pittsburgh shooting which was almost 60 years to the day earlier, when on October 12th, 1958, a bomb tore apart the temple, the oldest and most distinguished Reformed congregation in Atlanta. It's worth remembering about 10% of the bombs planted by extremists between 1954 and 1959 targeted Jewish institutions, synagogues, rabbis' homes, community centers. Of course, the other 90% in the South targeted African American institutions. Now, even as anti Semites in the South targeted Jews for supporting civil rights, some African Americans in the North began to turn on Jews really for not supporting civil rights enough. Yeah, they got it from both sides. For decades before then, blacks and Jews in the North had enjoyed something of a special relationship as victims of prejudice and as allies in the battle to oppose it. The early history of the NAACP reflects that alliance. But in the 1960s, the interests, visions, and priorities of the two communities began to diverge. Merit based educational programs, for example, aided Jews far more than they did African Americans. Anti Semitism, as I mentioned earlier, declined at a faster rate than racism, and Jews were able to move out to sparkling suburbs, like Newton, where I live, um, while blacks languished in dangerous inner cities. Subsequently, young radical advocates of black power, in conscious rebellion against their elders, came to view Jews more as obstacles than as allies. Some of them spread the hateful canard that Jews bore central responsibility for slavery. Others embraced the Palestinian cause and railed against the state of Israel. And a whole series of well publicized clashes over public school governance and small business ownership and neighborhood rule and related grievances, they began to build up, culminating in 1991 in an ugly riot. Local Jews always call it a pogrom in Brooklyn. This is the Crown Heights riot in Brooklyn. Jews blamed radical extremists within the Black community for fanning the flames of hatred, and in many ways braced themselves for worse to come. Now, what didn't quite make the news, but is important to our story, is that actually, after notwithstanding all these expectations, as the 1990s came to an end, tensions between blacks and Jews actually abated, in part, I think, because blacks and Jews in most of America no longer lived next door to one another, and partly because responsible leaders in both communities labored to tamp down tensions. So it was that when Leonard Dinerstein published the first and really still the only full scale scholarly history of American anti Semitism in 1994, his book actually ended on a hopeful note. Greater tolerance and acceptance of diversity in the United States, he concluded, showed that anti Semitism has declined in potency and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. Always dangerous to engage in prophecy when you're a historian. Members of the millennial generation born at that time soon concluded, as I mentioned in the beginning, that Jews had finally become white folks in America. They were past persecution. Yeah, Dinerstein's book was, in a way, an epitaph for anti-Semitism. Only people of color now faced hatred, it was thought. The subject of anti-Semitism actually faded from public view for about 2 decades. But as we now know, anti Semitism endured, especially at the margins of society. Um, on the extreme political right, Holocaust deniers, conspiracy theorists, neo Nazis, white supremacists continued to spout hatred against Jews. On the extreme left, black nationalists, those who delegitimized, demonized, applied double standards, 3Ds, to the state of Israel, as well as neo communists who blamed Jews for capitalism and globalization, and also advocates for the third world who kind of view America and Jews as interlinked colonial oppressors. They all spouted anti Jewish hatred too. So Jews got it. And Jews are unusual in getting it both from the extreme right and from the extreme left. On top of that, Islamist elements within American Islam, often influenced by their Arab counterparts in the Middle East, joined in anti Semitic attacks, aligning American Jews with Palestinians' long term enemies, the Israelis. Now, when you think about it, these three groups, extreme right, extreme left, and Islamists, actually have different complaints, different agendas. They don't have much in common. But what they do share is one great fantasy that so often characterizes anti Semites. They believe that Jews lie at the root of their problems. Now, from those three groups, initially standing at the margins, anti Semitism roared back into the mainstream in our time. The internet had much to do with that development, but I have to say, so did other kinds of social tensions, and probably so did the actions of the president. I talked about this a little at the very beginning. I want, in closing, to draw your attention, because in my view it has not received sufficient attention, to the anti Semitism actually reflected in last week's insurrection. Next slide, please. By now, it should be clear that some of those who traveled to Washington to support President Donald Trump were engaged in much more than just a doomed effort to maintain their hero in power. As their writings make clear, they also hope to trigger what they called a, quote, great revolution based on a fictionalized account of a government takeover and race war that, in its most extreme form, would exterminate Jews. I refer to the Turner Diaries, I get to them in a minute. Now, calls to exterminate, that's their word. Calls to exterminate Jews are common in far right and white nationalist circles. To give one example, the conspiracy theorists of QAnon, who hold that the world is run by a cabal of Satan worshiping pedophiles plotting against Mr. Trump. QAnon traffics in anti Semitism regularly. The anonymous Q, the group's purported head, who communicates in riddles and leaves clues on message boards, he once approvingly retweeted the anti Semitic image that you can see here of a knife wielding Jew wearing a Star of David necklace, who wallows in the blood of Russians, Poles, Hungarians, Ukrainians, and asks with feigned innocence, oh, why do they persecute me? Now, this idea that Jews, long-nosed Jews, dripping with blood of non-Jews, whom they are falsely accused of murdering, this idea is really a blood libel. And it has a long and tragic history, in part because if you want to encourage people to murder Jews, you have to argue, well, they're going to murder you. The Nazis said the same thing, and then it becomes a defense mechanism. And really, throughout history, these kinds of accusations have served as triggers of anti Semitic violence. More commonly, next slide, and we've seen this in recent days, QAnon has targeted the Jewish billionaire and philanthropist George Soros. Soros doesn't speak of himself as a Jew. He was born a Jew, but it doesn't matter. To QAnon and to those who around the world who are looking for the controlling figure in the world. In a conspiracy theory, everything is connected. Someone has to be in charge. Um, and here you really see it very well. He's portrayed as the primary figure shaping and controlling world events, whether it is the Arab Spring or the Ukraine Revolution or anti-Trump protests or refugee invasions or Ferguson or Black Lives Matter and so on. You may think it's very complicated and all sorts of extreme and complex social forces, but they know it's actually very simple. It's all due to the most evil man on the planet. He pulls all the strings. He is George Soros. Of course, a century ago, long before we had George Soros, it was the Rothschilds, the family of Jewish bankers, depicted in much the same way as the controllers of the world. That idea is, of course, famous or infamous in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. QAnon members also mark Jews with triple parentheses, what they call the echo, which is a covert means of outing those whom they consider usurpers and outsiders, not true members of the white race. Remember, it's not so easy to distinguish Jews from non-Jews in America. They don't look that different. The Nazis put yellow armbands on Jews or yellow stars for that reason. But these folks put echoes. They put three parentheses around Wolfowitz, around Pearl, around Feith, and around Ariel Sharon, so you will know who's Jewish and who is not. Um, Another website popular in white nationalist circles actually displayed photographs of Jewish women and men, more women than men, but my photograph was there too, which they downloaded from university websites, really with the same goal, to help readers distinguish miserable Jews from the Aryan master race. Next slide, please. Europeans are the children of God, they proclaim. They, and look at those three parentheses that echo, they, the Jews, are the children of Satan. White nationalists regularly employ the term, quote, white genocide as a shorthand way of expressing the fear that members of the white population of the United States, like they themselves, will soon be overwhelmed by people of color, by mixed race, and by Jews. There is a popular 14-word white supremacist slogan, and you actually saw some signs in Washington that alluded to it, that reads, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children." If you look at this carefully, you'll actually see much more sinister things. First of all, look at the shield, which resembles the Nazi swastika. Look at the background, the SS. Look at the lettering, which is a German kind of Fraktur English, a Fraktur lettering. But even look at the men, the women, the gender expressions. Those who know the work of the late George Massey will see that this is all borrowed from Nazi art. This slogan, and you will see the number 14. If you see 1488 on somebody's t-shirt, that refers to these 14 words, and 88 is a symbol of the double eighth letter of the alphabet, HH, 14 words, and Heil Hitler. And these folks like such codes. But these 14 words were composed by David Lane. Some will remember that name. He was one of the conspirators behind the 1984 assassination of the Jewish radio host Alan Berg. And these 14 words were part of a much larger document, which we don't have time to read, entitled the White Genocide Manifesto. The White Genocide Manifesto, very important in the far right today, has 14 planks. It insists Jews are not white and that they are a danger to white civilization. All Western nations are ruled by a Zionist conspiracy to mix, overrun, exterminate the white race. The manifesto's seventh plank reads. Now, certainly the manifesto is influenced by the protocols of the elders of Zion and by Nazi writings, but it actually goes far further, blaming members of what it euphemistically calls the Zionist occupation government of America. And you will sometimes see the acronym ZOG, ZOG, in this literature, a Zionist occupation government, and it blames Jews for homosexuality, for abortion. Jews are conveniently blamed for everything that they hate. QAnon followers, the Proud Boys, other far-right and alt-right groups, the very people who converged on Washington, they imagined that they were living out the great fantasy that underlies what many consider to be the Bible of white nationalism. There's an article about it today, finally, in the New York Times. You may have seen an article in the LA Times. The 1978 dystopian novel entitled The Turner Diaries by William Luther Pierce. He wrote it under that pseudonym, Andrew MacDonald. By the way, the novel was removed today from Amazon, but it's sold in hundreds of thousands and is very, very widely read and known. The novel depicts the violent overthrow of the government of the United States, nuclear conflagration, race war, and the ultimate extermination of non-whites and, quote, undesirable racial elements among the remaining white population. And the gallows erected, there it is, the gallows erected in front of the Capitol last week recall the novel's descriptions of, quote, the day of the rope, when so-called betrayers of their race were lynched. And the novel goes on to depict, quote, a war to the death with the Jew. You can go to the next one. And I want to emphasize this because I think some who have even talked about the Turner Diaries have played down their anti Semitic elements. They've talked about other things, but they scarcely mention the fact that this novel is a novel about exterminating Jews, also exterminating others, but the Jewish extermination is central. Your day is coming, Jews. Your day is coming. So it warns. And at the novel's conclusion, we see mass lynchings, a takeover of Washington, which is supposed to set off a worldwide conflagration. And then within a few days, quote, the throat of the last Jewish survivor in the last kibbutz and in the last smoking ruin in Tel Aviv has been cut. Now, the Turner Diaries denouement, which is the death of Jews, coupled with the anti-Semitic images from the Capitol last week, serve, I think, as timely reminders that anti-Semitism has not disappeared. For all the success that Jews have achieved, and notwithstanding the scholarly claims in some circles that Jews have become white and privileged, we dare not forget that there is a long and painful history of anti Semitism in the United States. And to this day, some, not everybody, indeed, probably only a small minority, but some, including many of those who stormed the Capitol last week, do continue to dream of Jews' ultimate extermination. So I've gone on a long time, and now it's your turn. Um,
Okay,
any questions? Yeah.
I'm going to boil down three questions. One of them was submitted by a proud graduate of Brandeis in the class of 1978. And I'm going to paraphrase it. You gave us a lot of background about the relationship between African American community and the Jewish community. And Jerry's question is, what can be done about it? What can we do? What can we do to improve these relations?
Well, I think, and here historians are better at analyzing the past than at giving prescriptions for the future. But I do think that part of the problem has been that blacks and Jews don't know each other very well. They live far from one another. Um, and I am actually quite hopeful looking at Georgia, where we saw Ossoff and Warnock, the two senators, running together, revering one another, talking about John Lewis, who had many Jewish supporters, that this can create a new image for blacks and Jews that will allow kind of movement further, movement forward in a more positive way. I think many African Americans have been astonished to see this hatred against Jews. They too imagined that only peoples of color were victims in the United States, and it's important that they know that is not the case. Um, uh, Obviously, at a much deeper level, if African Americans, if we have policies that allow African Americans to succeed better in the United States, to move up, they are more likely then to interact with Jews, to understand Jews, and some of the tensions that have existed may dissipate. Now, I understand very well that some in the African American community have bought into the idea that they have to side in an intersectional way with all persecuted peoples, chief among them the Palestinians. That, of course, is hugely problematic. It's logically nonsense. And I think, we need other models, but I do think that as African Americans see that Jews have suffered in this country and they learn both about the history of anti-Semitism and about the history of Black-Jewish relations, which is little known, that may help improve the situation. But as I say, I'm better at chronicling the past than predicting the future.
Okay, well, that being said, you're still being asked to be a soothsayer. What
Okay.
can you do? Will the Jewish American experiment soon be over? And are you telling your own children and grandchildren that they will need a plan B? And that's from Barack Barcone.
So it's a very, very important question. None of us imagined that we would even ask that question. And I think I'd love to do a study of this. It's not what I do, but I wonder how many Jews at some point in the last 5 years have asked that question to themselves, have had a talk that they never expected to have with their spouse. Maybe the American experiment is over. But I want to emphasize, and at this moment, it's especially important to emphasize that the future is not something that was preordained and all we do is sit home and watch on television how it unfolds. I deeply believe that we shape the future. Our actions do make a difference. What Congress does in the next months is going to make a difference. And what Jews do in terms of educating their own children will make a difference. Um, uh, my friend Mr. Barcohen asks a good question about my own children and grandchildren. I think we are a very fortunate Jewish community in that we actually know, as Jews in the 1930s do not know, that if some horrific transformation occurred in America and Jews suddenly had to leave, and most of us know we could go to Israel and Israel would welcome us with open arms. And many, I think, don't appreciate, because we haven't taught this history very well, how fortunate we are in contrast to the situation that existed prior to World War II. And I'm very proud that my children have spent considerable time in Israel and speak Hebrew. So that option would be an easy one for them. And that, I think, is important for Jews at some deep level to know that today there is a country where if we knock, they have to let us in. Whereas East European and Central European Jews who knocked on America's doors in the 1930s were, for the most part, kept out, and that made a huge difference. But God willing, there'll be a new president and a new mood in the country, and we'll all be more optimistic, and I'll be able to put all my notes about American anti-Semitism in a drawer. Uh, so it is, we will play a role in shaping this future. But yeah, uh, 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 Jews should have passports and should know Israel, uh, because that gives us an option if, God forbid, we need it.
Okay, here's a question from our guest rabbi who's visiting us during the week. And the question is, or the observation is that you've shown all kinds of recent anti-Semitic advertising and literature. And the question is, do you think there will be a chance that these will become illegal?
Well, as we saw already, there is in the United States a tension between those who feel that we really need to ban certain forms of hate speech, that a society needs to protect itself, that you don't have the right to cry fire in a crowded theater. That's one view. And on the other side are those who say, wait a minute, the Constitution says that there is free speech. That's the First Amendment, and that's the glory of America. And they remind us that, if you don't like the speech, the appropriate response is more speech. Persuade people that you're right and they're wrong. There's a very important debate in the United States. I have to say that the internet, that modern technology, and what we have ourselves experienced, I think shows that it's a more complicated debate than it was back in the days of the founders, or even in the days of Louis Brandeis. I have to mention Louis Brandeis once in every talk in my contract. But Louis Brandeis was a kind of free speech absolutist. Um, and I think it's much more complicated, and what we've all experienced shows that it's more complicated. So there is a kind of tension between our commitment to truth and our commitment to free speech. And the decisions made over the next few years as we see this battle carry forward will be immensely important. Um, I do think that prior to Donald Trump, there was a kind of postmodernist sense. We never know the truth. And I remember being at lectures where learned professors laughed at the idea of truth with a capital T. I think that we've all had to reassess that idea, because we've seen where it leads. If there is no such thing as truth, I have my truth, you have your truth. I think I won the election, you think somebody else won the election, and there is no idea of truth. That may well be the undoing of our society. But how exactly we balance truth with free speech, and whether we can come up with appropriate means of balancing them, even on the internet and through social media, that is really the challenge of our time, of the 21st century. And one hopes that there are very smart people who are thinking about that challenge.
Okay, I think this will be our last question, and I think it's apropos because it has an eye on next week's inauguration. And that is, do you think the fact that Joe Biden has included a significant number of Jews in his cabinet, will that make him a target of indirect anti-Semitism?
Well, I think um, anti-Semites know that Jews are responsible for a wide range of evils, even when those evils, even before those evils take place. In other words, anti Semites know in advance that it's all a Jewish conspiracy, and this will just reinforce their views. Um, but Jews have long been worried. Oh, don't put too many Jews, that'll be bad for us. Famously, Sulzberger of the New York Times um, warned FDR not to appoint a second Jew to the Supreme Court. I think it was Felix Frankfurter. He was afraid that this would stoke anti-Semitism. I don't actually think that Jews um, benefit from going that route. The truth is, it's the anti-Semites problem, not the Jewish problem. And I think Jews should be proud of the fact that many Jews have trained in lots of places. They've moved up and so forth. But I don't deny at all that the people who believe there is a Jewish conspiracy, it will be reinforced by what they see in the Biden cabinet. But of course, we know that there were also some very significant Jews in the Republican Party. That's probably a good thing that there are Jews on both sides. A reminder that it is only in the conspiratorial mind of anti-Semites that all Jews are working together for common nefarious ends. In real life, I'm sure this is not news to anyone in the audience. In real life, Jews actually disagree with one another. They fight with one another. They have many different opinions. There are some who are conservative, some who are liberal, and so on. And that's the real message that we should convey. That rather than worrying, oh, maybe there are too many Jews and this will lead to anti-Semitism. Uh, I'm not disagreeing with the premise. I am suggesting that those people who think that Jews control things, they've known it even before Biden appointed even one Jew. And as the example of a line that I used, the idea that the New Deal was the Jew deal and that President Roosevelt was a Jew named Roosevelt. They also made Rockefeller into a Jew, is a reminder that in many cases, the ascription of Judaism it tells you more about the anti-Semite than about any form of reality. We can't prevent it, but we certainly need to be very careful about those who encourage policies that would have Jews hide or hold back, lest it stoke anti-Semitism. We should live the best, and this is a good way to end. We should live the best lives we possibly can live. We should try to be role models of upstanding living and be proud of being Jews in that position. And if people then say the Jews control things, well, we'll be very proud that as Jews, we manage to advance and improve the country in which we lived.
Jonathan, on behalf of the Adult Education Committee, and I'm sure all the attendees as well, I really want to thank you for such a stimulating, thought-provoking, and really timely class. The Adult Education Committee would like to acknowledge the vigorous support of the board led by Randy Brent and extend a special thanks to Heidi Joseph, the VP of Programming, who plays a pivotal role in our work. The members of the committee invest their time and talent to create an array of programs which play a key role in maintaining the connection between the Jewish Center and its congregants. This has been especially true during the pandemic. I would like to thank Gil Gordon, who was our Zoom master for tonight. And finally, I would like to thank you, the attendees from near and far, for joining us this evening. Be well, stay safe, good night.